during what the world now calls the Holocaust. The word is ascribed to a period in history when the Nazis systematically, brutally murdered 6 million Jews and other minorities just because of who they were or what they believed in. Hitler was elected chancellor for many reasons, not the least of which was anti-Semitism, hate of the Jews. He ate, slept, and dreamt his hate. Just 2 months after his election on April 1st, 1933, Hitler declared a boycott of all Jewish-owned shops and businesses, and the SA, his armed Nazi police, stood guard at these places to ensure the success of the boycott. Shortly after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, as I mentioned, my father was assaulted on the way home from work by these Nazi thugs. One was a man that my father had known from school. These thugs thought it would be fun and earn them credit with their unit to beat up a Jew, whom Hitler described as the source of all the problems in Germany. Well, my father, Charles, he changed his name to Charles, was a terrific athlete and a boxer, and he fought back, and he knocked out one of these thugs, and the others ran off. But they knew who my father was, and Charles realized he was in danger. So he packed up and said goodbye to his mother, sister, and 3 brothers, and fled to France. He and my mother, Frida Court, were dating seriously, and Charles insisted that she also get a passport and a visa. So Charles called her as he was leaving Germany and said, "Come to France and we'll be married there." They were married in the city hall of a Paris suburb, all alone, except for the mayor. No family, no friends, no relatives. November 9th, 1938 is a date that in Jewish history, like December the 7th, 1941, in American history, will go down in infamy, to quote President Roosevelt. That day and all night, the Nazis carried out raids against Jews in Germany. They burned Jewish-owned stores and synagogues and beat up Jews and sent many to concentration camps. Now the world could see what the Nazi regime had in store for the European Jews. This event was called the Night of Broken Glass, or in German, Kristallnacht, because of all the window glass covering the streets all over the country. On the 3rd day after the war started, September the 4th, 1939, Charles had to report for internment. Internment was really imprisonment. All men between 17 and 50 years old of German and Austrian nationality living in France were rounded up. The French feared that there might be spies among them. The men were taken to football stadiums for internment, where they stayed for about 10 days, sleeping in the bleachers with hardly any food or facilities. My mother, Frida, was hysterical. She had a 9-month-old baby. She was all alone. Her husband had been taken prisoner, and her family was in another country, far away and also in danger. Most of the men were then taken to French concentration camps in the south. In her diary, Frida wrote that she cried for a week. My father, who had enlisted in the French army, was allowed to join a unit of the French Foreign Legion. He did not come home until Christmas, before he was shipped out to join a unit in North Africa. So Papa was gone, and Frida waited along with the rest of the French people for things to get worse, and they did. In May, Nazi Germany invaded Norway, Holland, and then Belgium. Frida saw these poor refugees coming into France with strollers and baby carriages and mattresses and household things. Frida writes in her diary that people were urged to send children from Paris to a safer place in France. France was expected to be invaded and bombed any day. Frida wrote, "I will live with my child, or we will perish together." On June the 10th, Frida turned on the radio and heard that the Germans were just on the outskirts of Paris. Any time that Frida was out, she could be stopped by the police or a German patrol and asked for her papers, and she would be susceptible to arrest. So she packed a backpack and a small suitcase and took me in a stroller and headed for the only railroad station still operating. When she got to a town called Niort, she tried to rent a room, but everything was already taken. So she went to the refugee agency, and they placed her in the countryside in an old farmhouse. During that time, my mother got very sick. She had not heard from my father. She didn't know about her family in Germany, and she wanted to die. The farmer who helped to take care of me said to her, "You have to get healthy and live for your little girl." And she did get better. By October 1940, 4 months after fleeing Paris, the news came that things had settled down a little in Paris, and my mother decided to go home. She had ended up in German-occupied territory anyhow, and couldn't get to the south without help. She was hoping to get news and help from my father, so she returned to the apartment in Paris. Finally, the following summer, in August 1941, when I was 2.5 years old, my mother heard from my father that he had been let out of the service because he had been injured. He had found a job in a city in the south, in the Free Zone, which was under the French government. Now came the very difficult and dangerous undertaking of getting my mother and me to cross into the Free Zone. Her passage was successful, and she met up with my father in the city where we stayed and where I started kindergarten until that day in 1943 when I was 5 years old, and my mother came to grab me from school. She had heard that the Germans had invaded the south and were rounding up the Jews in our city. Luckily for us, they had started on the other side of town. My father had been with us for a few months, but started to be away for long periods. He had joined the French resistance movement and now was in even more danger. But he felt he had to help defeat the Nazis. He learned how to set bombs and how to defuse bombs. He helped to blow up railroad tracks so that the Germans would be prevented from bringing in arms and supplies. He also helped to blow up bridges. It was a scary time. One day, we heard that the Americans had landed in the Northwest. It was, of course, D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. The church bells rang, and we went into the village where people seemed to be so happy. May the 8th, 1945, the church bells rang everywhere. Again, we went into town. The villagers were ecstatic. There were flowers everywhere, and people were drinking wine in the streets. I remember the horses being decked out in flower lays and people hugging and kissing. The bells kept on ringing, and the festivities went on for several days. The war in Europe finally had come to an end. We were safe. Not quite. Now my parents were not citizens of Germany any longer, nor were they citizens of France. These had commanded raids throughout Western Europe of apartments and stole the furniture belonging to refugees who had fled. They called this the furniture raids. They had sent all this stuff to Germany to furnish German homes. My father applied again for French citizenship as a veteran of the war in which he had fought for 6 years in the French Foreign Legion, the French Army, and the French Resistance. So we went back to the city in the south. Our apartment consisted of 2 rooms, a bedroom and a living room, a dining room combination with a pull-out kitchen. It was all we could afford, and all we could get as apartments were very scarce because of all the refugees who had fled from Germany, Austria, Belgium, Hungary, and Alsace-Lorraine. One day, as I was playing with some children outside of our apartment, the children started to taunt me and called me a dirty Jew. I didn't even know what a Jew was, and I thought I was Catholic like everybody else. So I went upstairs and asked my parents if I was Jewish, and they replied yes. But you must never be ashamed of it or allow anyone to ridicule you. My parents started to attend synagogue, especially my mother, who went to say prayers for her family whom she found out had been murdered in the concentration camps. And I was enrolled in religious school where I learned about Judaism and to read and write Hebrew. By 1946, life had gotten back to normality. They got new passports which designated their nationality as stateless. And by selling most of their belongings, they bought tickets for a ship to take them to America. We arrived in New York in June 1947. We had survived the hell of World War II and the war against the Jews. Thank you.